My name is Jennifer Gray Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director of Rebuild North Bay Foundation. This podcast is specifically designed to bring you people who have been through what maybe you have just gone through or that you are concerned about. We created the podcast How to Disaster to show you the breadth and depth of humanity in the midst of this really terrible thing that happened. I wanted to do this podcast so that I could bring some of the most amazing leaders that I've ever known in my life to you. You may have just experienced a disaster, and you may be looking around and you are dealing with trauma and the shock of it. And you may be wondering, I don't know how to do this part. And so we purposefully made this podcast into different sections and different topics of recovery so that you could pick and choose what would work for you at that time. So welcome to How to Disaster, and thank you for giving us your time. Welcome to another edition of How to Disaster, the podcast to help you recover, rebuild, and reimagine. Today, I'm so pleased to have with us Supervisor James Gore. Now, I've known Supervisor Gore since probably about 2014 when he was first elected to the Board of Supervisors in Sonoma County. And, at that time, none of us really knew what was in front of us, which was the onset of the era of mega fires. And the first place that really showed up was in our county, in Sonoma, Napa, Lake, and Mendocino, in our region. Now, a lot of things happen in a disaster, but one of the things is you'd have to figure out what's the role of the public sector. How can they be of help, and how can they actually get in the way of public safety, progress, recovery, and rebuilding? I love working with James Gore because I find him to be a champion for progress. I often quote him when I'm talking to newly fire-affected communities about the importance of really valuing relentless, imperfect progress. I love his approach to collaboration, and I appreciate the fact that he is an elected official who will always pick up the phone to call that person who can actually make it happen and get it done. In fact, get it done, but with a different word for it is really his mantra. And so I asked him to come here today to really talk to you and give some advice about not only how to be a public official in the midst of a disaster, but how to be a champion for change from the community's level too. Because what we often don't hear is an elected official saying, I really want more people to lobby me for the change that they wish to see. So there are ways to do that. And I'm really excited to have him here. He's also chair of the Resilient Communities and is a leader for the National Association of Counties. So his impact isn't just in Sonoma County, it's also nationwide. So I think a lot of the wisdom and experience that he'll bring to this discussion today will really help some of you out there in our audience figure out how to disaster. So welcome to James Gore, who is a colleague and also a friend. I'm so excited to have you on today, and I appreciate having some of your very valuable time. I wanted you to know that, I did some notes for this podcast, and at the very end, I wrote that the theme I wanted it to be was called Diving into the Wreck. And that's a poem by Adrienne Rich that I really love, which isn't so much about, it's not about disaster, but it is about having to take an assessment and to not be afraid to dive all the way in and to come out the other side somewhat transformed. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and welcome.
Heck yeah. Diving into the wreck every day, right? Ubiquitous uncertainty and disruption surrounding us, but what a prime opportunity to get stuff done each and every day. Looking forward to being with you today.
So can you actually start off by orienting our audience, which if you think about our audience, it's really groups of people who have it's a person who's either just gone through a disaster, maybe they're in mid-recovery of a disaster, a year or two, or maybe it's a person who just is in the public sector or not, but it wants to build resiliency into their world where they are currently. So what I'd like you to do is, can you give us a little bit of background? You have a great background. And talk to us about your position now, including at NACO and for the local Sonoma County Board of Supervisors.
Yeah, it's You know, resiliency can oftentimes these days be confused as a buzzword, but what I love about it is that it really defines this idea of not just being able to get hit and get back up, but how to, as one person put it, a former FEMA administrator said, stronger in the broken places, right? How we rise up and build better systems out of what we're dealing with, and how we make sure that we own our place in the future, as opposed to forgive our optimism and become pessimists and throw our hands into the air and give up. It's exhausting work working on this stuff, whether you're a person who has been through a disaster personally, whether you've led an organization or volunteered in support of others. We all know what it's like to deal with disasters, in a sense that it has the blood pumping intensity of pure work, of pure purpose and passion. But then on the other side, it has the hard burn associated with it. You'll meet people who every day might be going through 7 stages of grief, and other people who it might take 10 years for them to process that pain. At the same time, though, you know, we got to keep improving systems. The world's changing around us more rapidly than we know, and the institutions of the past cannot handle what is in front of us. And so from my background, you know, I was born and raised here in Sonoma County, got out, wanted to go get the heck out of this place, this beautiful place, because I thought it wasn't that cool when I was about 18. And college, Peace Corps in Bolivia and South America, living in the jungle, horseback, and then Washington, D.C. I worked for, represented wine industry, and then worked for the Obama administration, led conservation efforts around the U.S. And that when I came back home, when I chose to come back to this place that I tried to get the heck away from, I found myself gravitating towards servant leadership, and through you know, just believing not just seeing problems, but getting involved and fixing stuff. That can be an insatiable appetite sometimes, because problems are ubiquitous, but at the same time, it's a crazy opportunity. And so just a final is that I was elected in, I think, 2014, right? And I started in 2015. 2015, 2016, pretty quiet. A lot of complacency in our community. You know that. We used to work together, right? A lot of people focused on first world problems. Why isn't this perfect? Why isn't this perfect? And then in October of 2017, we got punched straight in the face by not just a wildfire, but a veritable natural disaster. Diablo winds, hurricane winds came into our community, caught us on our heels, and it took us a long time to get back onto our toes. And once we organized community and did all these other things, we learned what the true power of resilience and embracing that portfolio is all about. And it's been far more learning than I've been teaching. And but you know, I've been a lead nationally, National Association of Counties, a chair of Resilient Counties, testifying before Congress, lead the effort statewide. I'm the president of California Counties this year, and created their resilient portfolio, and work with the governor's office on getting money, resources, time, prioritization into these efforts. It's time not to just be, as we say, Sonoma strong after disaster, or before a disaster, be Sonoma ready, but be Sonoma safe.
That was a perfect introduction, so thank you, because it encapsulates so much of actually why I like working with you. And one of the things is about your approach to servant leadership, and it is a different approach. Can you talk to us about why that's so important, especially in the midst of a natural disaster?
Gosh, you know, it's crazy because I've got the chills right now. It's like you're bringing me back to those moments. When you talked about that, the first thing that goes into my mind is that, you know, I'm in the public sector. I'm an elected official. I don't like to call myself a politician, because some people think that's a bad word, right? But when things were going crazy in 2017 and before that, and what I've learned is diving deep into it, is that I have access, and I need to give people that access. I don't need to hold that to myself, right? You and I know of a lot of people in my position and other positions like yourself. They go to briefings, they sit in big tents as disaster people, run around and talk about high level things and show maps. Then they put out a little bit of communications, a press release to the community. And for me, it's been all about getting people what they want and what they ask for. So if they want to know where the fire is, I go out and I interview the fire captain, and I have them get out a map. And you know what? All of a sudden, instead of 200 people clicking on a link because it's like, oh, I want to see, all of a sudden 50,000 people watch a video. And I'm like, wow, okay, cool. Now I need to facilitate me to get out of the way of me to get all these other awesome people talking, and help translate what they say as professionals into our community, because our community wants to know what's going on. They want to know how to empower themselves. They want to know what they need to change. They have power. You just have to create some infrastructure underneath them. So servant leadership in my mind is part of it's leading by following, right? You have to keep your nose to the ground, or as they say, get the pulse of the community. And once you catch that, you have to start to feed that, right? And if you help people rise up, the fascinating thing is they start to hold you even more accountable. And that's good, because then they want more, right? They want more progress. That's what I want.
So as a very visible public sector leader, you and I worked at the county, and you were elected, and I worked in the board of supervisors too as a staffer. And one of the things that was notable to me was, we know the capabilities, especially of department heads, and that they they work very hard. But when the wildfires came through, the disaster was so big and so stunning, even the Cal Fire, that our public sector sort of almost like some people could jump out in front of it and do really well despite their own trauma. You were one of those people. But for a lot of the county staff in the public sector, they had also undergone the disaster, and many had lost their homes. And then they were charged with this really difficult mission of carrying on everything they'd done before, in addition to responding to an unprecedented natural disaster. And there was mixed results who was able to deal with that because of that essence of trauma in between. Can you talk about what that was like to navigate, and any ideas or advice that came out of that experience?
God, you hit it perfectly. I think in the intro is that, there's people in our emergency operations center who were worried about if they lost their home. Karen Fees, our head of human services, fled her home and went to her office and sat there and mobilized her team of, 700 employees while her home burnt down, right? I can still feel it. So there's this crazy thing about not being able to be a professional, but being embedded into the very storm that you're sailing through. And I think in a certain ways it makes you more human, and it shows you really how much you can handle, because everybody was personally invested. You were running out into Sonoma Valley doing what I was doing and trying to hit everybody and everything and just get the sense of what was going on, because a lot of people in those initial moments, they have that deer in the headlights look, and it's like the fog of war around the community. And it was just about being like, you okay? Do you need a connection to something? It started with just a soft understanding. And then there's this point where certain folks just dive in. And, you've talked about this a little bit. You said diving into the wreck. One thing that I always say is that, hell hath no fury like trying to really make progress in imperfect systems. You try and stick your head into a problem, and all the people who have talked about the problem for years want to attack you for having the audacity to not talk to them first about what they've learned. And then the other ones want to critique you while you're going through it, to say what you're doing isn't good enough. But you just get busy and you start to build momentum. I say the hardest thing in this world is to create momentum out of thin air. And then the only thing harder than the hardest thing is to try and recreate lost momentum, because there's a lack of belief that it worked the first time. So, that momentum came from our community. It came from this overwhelming need to say, hey, we need to mobilize. And so, one thing I learned with our staff and with everybody in the exhaustion and the overwhelmingness of it is that you have to allow people to grieve in real time. You have to be civic and civil, even at the same time that you have to have confrontational conversations and get it out, and not be so nice that you don't get to the point. And then ultimately, you got to make the we a bigger than a small we. The we of government oftentimes pushes partners out, private sector partner, faith-based partners, nonprofit partners out, and it's like, hey, we're in the Department of Emergency Management. We got this. And you're like, you have basically 10% of the resources that we have in this community if you work with us to mobilize. And they're sometimes too busy working so hard to stop. And instead of being too damn busy to do damn good work, is stop and really realize how to partner and how to roll. And that's what you guys did with Rebuild, right?
That was, yeah, so we were founded on the very idea that in no way should we only depend upon the public sector. That's just way too big for any one sector to deal with, nonprofit, private, or public sector. And then we all had to bandy together in order to even begin to figure this out. And it was still going to be extremely hard and take a very long time and a lot of talents, And so one of the things I was super grateful for is, in our first year, we were like, we're just going to sit back and kind of, we'll do our work, but we do not want to crowd the market of disaster. We want to learn and be long-term. In that time, though, one of the things that you did right away that led us to our first projects is the block captains system. And so what's really cool for us is that with the convening that we held with Campfire and and Woolsey Fire about 18 months later, you guys were able to then talk to them about it. They adapted it to zone captains, and now we work in Southern Oregon. They took the zone captains, so now they are third generation for that system that was put forth, and they really feel like it's the most powerful tool in their box. And so, can you talk about that moment and tell the story of when you're in the theater and you're faced with these giant town halls that are also a place where people are processing emotion and upset and a lot of anger and grief, and then how you sort of channeled that with the help of the community into something so incredibly productive that it actually changed the trajectory of how those parts of the community rebuilt.
It is overwhelmingly shocking how much power and momentum is out there if all you do is build a foundation for folks to be able to get their feet on steady ground. A long time ago, somebody told me, in the sense of politics, there was a presidential campaign going on, and we said, God, there's something out there that somebody has not yet ignited, but there's a burn that's ready. And I say that pun intended. Right now we're talking about fires and other things. This is that, there was a secondary fire in our community after the actual Tubbs Nuns Pocket complex had died down. And that was the fire in the community for progress, for where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And so what happened is that as you and I have talked about, the disaster industrial complex, as we call it, descends. The consultants come in on parachutes. Hey, we can get the FEMA money for you. You FEMA folks, the California Office of Emergency Services, the nonprofit groups. You have the American Red Cross there trying to manage and stuff, and you're swarming all this stuff around, and you're trying to figure out where you put your fingers on areas that need support, that are not working, and then other ones that you just get away from, because it's like, get away if it's going right, because something's going right. What was not going right in my mind is that the big town halls and the other things, we were having hundreds and thousands of people come in, and we were doing way too much lip service. And then we were trying to control that anger and that emotion. And I say we, because it was like, we had the congressmen, and then we had the state legislature, and then we had the heads of emergency services, and then some of, me and my colleagues. And it's like you're 20 speakers deep, and you're trying to organize this, sometimes to fit everybody's ego, to have a talking engagement while they're standing back there. And people are sitting there going, I need less updates, and I need to know what I do. Like, where do I go? How do I get food? Is there going to be individual assistance? Or get out of my way and let me get back on my property? And the forum did not facilitate that. It facilitated the opposite, which was it enraged people who couldn't get simple questions answered. And so this goes back to my point earlier about getting people access and organizing, simple organizing. So I was like, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop doing these countywide things. I'm going to go back to my district, and I'm going to I worked with a school, the Mark West School District, and they sent out notes to all the parents. They had the best email list you could find, right? And we hosted a forum. And then we hosted a second one in a theater with Coffee Park. And then we hosted a couple more. And all I did was go back and get maps of my district where I'd knocked on doors when I was running for office. And I looked at the maps, and I got all these people together, and I said, what I'm going to do today is just organize you. Community Organizing 101. I had my staff leads put a pad of paper and a pencil that had the headings on the top of name, contact info, insurance provider, right? And the address where you live. And then I just started drawing on those maps and saying, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4, zone 5. You guys go over there, get to know each other. Each of you select somebody who's a block captain. I'm not looking for a leader who wants to give speeches. I'm looking for somebody who wants to meet weekly. This is how organizing works. You can't always meet with 500 people and get something done. So how do you empower, thousands of people to be represented in a weekly breakfast at 6:30 a.m. for a year straight, doing that? Fascinating part of that is it just started to fly and gain momentum. And then they were validators for their neighborhood. They all of a sudden stepped up and became leaders. And I would just bring in different folks to come and speak to them. What do you guys need next week? What do you need 2 weeks from now? And we staffed it so that they didn't have to keep all the notes, that we kept minutes and they could send them out to people. It was just so cool to see them find an anchor in that, in something so simple. And to finish that out, I think one of the things that was most fascinating, Jennifer, as you've seen not only in our county, but other areas, is how oftentimes we're like, hey, this worked, or this is working. And even some of my own peers in the county were like, oh, my people don't really want to do this. And I was like, your people, your constituents are coming to my meetings, and you can come and we can collaborate, or you can do your own. But even with other areas, like when we went and deal with Butte and in Southern Oregon, and some people are like, just like, hey, I'm not trying to own your disaster, man. I'm just trying to tell you there's a way to do this smart.
I know that one of the fears initially in Paradise was that the block captain, zone captain system would be used against the public sector, that it was like really frightening for some people up there who were in the public sector, because they thought they could be activated to essentially make their lives more miserable. And I know that I had to have calls. I'm sure you had to have calls. We were like, no, this is actually your secret weapon. This is partnership with your community, and, really having them take some of the weight of it off. But also what you're talking about, like, see how far they can run with it and see how fast they will rebuild with it. And like, we didn't know, we were only 13 months in when campfire started, but we knew that worked for sure. And we're seeing some of the same traction up in Oregon. And for the first time, we actually saw public funds for the zone captain system up there too.
Oh, that's great.
I know.
Well, and to talk about that, like all of a sudden, 3-4 years later, you see that these people, they go back to their communities because they rebuilt with more community than existed beforehand.
Amen.
They've done these resiliency projects that now they're potlucks on the streets. They're inviting us to, to cookouts and the organizing meetings, and they're all of a sudden active. And yeah, for certain politicians, that's a fearful thing. Oh God, my people are rising up. For me, that's a wave I want to embrace, because I can get way more done than I can on my own. I mean, not coincidentally, those folks I work with them to bring proposals before the Board of Supervisors. I ask them to lobby my colleagues. I ask them to lobby me. They get mad at me sometimes because they don't think I'm doing enough anymore, because I'm focused on COVID and viruses instead of fire recovery. But that's the kind of accountable world that we need to be a part of. That's the kind of democracy that I love. The areas, not surprisingly, and this too, many of the areas that burnt in 2017 were some of the quietest areas, civic engagement wise, in our community. It was the suburbs, on that wild urban interface, where we really got into not just the first 1,000 homes burnt down really in the wildlands, but those next 4,000 homes were heavily embedded into suburban areas. And those are areas where people are working their butts off. They're coming home to feed their kids, cook dinner, they're going to bed at night, and they're not sitting around going to community forums all the time. But now they are alive. I mean, they are creating organizations, they're fundraising, they're identifying what kind of development they want in their area and not. Super cool.
And they're also paying it forward to other new fire survivors, because we've certainly been able to access that system a lot. Another hugely ancillary benefit of that was that when they had these gaping needs that arose, because they spoke with one voice, it was actually easier for them to communicate with you. You could support them, and you could also work from the county side, as the city did too, to then amplify what those needs are. There were unmet needs, and so, like, one of the things that I love was this meeting that we had at, 7 in the morning about the fence, the rise up fence for Mark West Estates, which for
Oh,
those
yeah.
who aren't familiar, it was $500,000 project, mild common fencing, and we were like, okay, I think we can take this on, but it took 21 funders in 10 months, and like every ounce of you and I, that's for sure, to get that part done. But your relentless and perfect progress approach was very helpful and inspiring for me, because then I knew that I was never alone in that, which is a really important thing to have. But also you were like, oh yeah, so we could totally get this done. And you know what we can do? We can do it with one permit. We do not need to get 47 permits for every home. I'll go back and talk to the county. We're going to find out if, just to keep the cost down, that if they can pre-approve the design, and the design was what the community asked for. So that's another thing I hear from you often, and that we've done since the beginning of Rebuild, which is, what do you need and how can we help and how do we get to yes? And you were immediately, as a public sector leader, able to go back to your own department and say, here are some of the barriers and we can remove them. Tell us about that.
Well, public sector and private sector, and then nonprofit sector, and then the different iterations of nonprofit sector. I think it's a perfect segue right now, because the public sector, is slower. Like, I think of the public sector as a big, beastly tractor. It's very hard to turn, but it can move a ton of dirt. It has huge resources behind it, right? And if you can get, whether it's law changes, general plan amendments, big funding, you get grants, multi-million dollars from some area, disaster funding, other things in, you can do that. But, on the other side, it's like, in the private sector, what you did with Rebuild and what we worked on is that it wasn't a sports car. It was like an all-terrain vehicle, right? It was like there's like this awesome Jeep out there that's like can tow something or do whatever, and you just kept hitching up. And so it's like, for me to be able to look at you and go, this is not a good place for government. This would probably take me. We could do it, but you've worked in government too. It takes 6 months to get a resolution from the board, to get us identified, to create an office to support it, to hire people through HR, to go through these processes. When in fact, it's like, a lot of times people come and ask me for money, right? I'm like, it'd be way better if I could help you fundraise than asking for this amount of money out of the county. I can supplement you later, do other things, but like, what does a government need to do? A government needs to get out of its way and realize that it's not the only end all of the public good. That's the biggest thing that government needs to do. And we've seen this with the pandemic recently, and even our own Department of Public Health, is that there's been far too many resources that have been set on the sidelines. I think about our partners in the faith-based community who are sitting there going, like, we were the safety net before you government came around, and we still have buildings and we can do vaccines and all these other things, but you're just like, you're unsafe, so go away and we're going to manage this, right? And we saw that time and again through our first iteration of recovery. And you guys had to really blow through that, because some people are inherently, they don't trust government, and then they don't trust business to help them. And you're like, well, okay, let's not get into trust. Look at my plan, look at my actions, and look at what we're doing. And then you have people run after you and say, I don't know if you did that for the right reasons. And you and I have dealt with this, is like the post hoc critic who comes in and writes all these critical analysis.
Visit a local manufactured home retailer to get started and ask them about cross-mod homes that qualify for the MH Advantage financing. With customizable layouts and features and surprisingly affordable mortgage financing options, take the first step forward in rebuilding your vibrant community, your town, your paradise, with an MH Advantage qualifying home today.
So James, one of the things you mentioned is that it's very easy it's easy to sit for some people on the sidelines, and that's their whole job, is to not build things, but to destroy things. And my advice to any group is, don't be afraid of that, because the audience that counts is the people that you're serving. And if you hold integrity at the corner of everything you do, you'll be fine. No matter what.
Well put. And ultimately, that's a part of a process of growing up and doing things in this world. Once again, back to our idea or point about diving into the wreck. You get into that wreck, all of a sudden you realize that you're inside the wreck and you're trying to fix it. And everybody's like, what are you doing in that wreck? Why did you create that? How did you do that? Are you there for the right reasons? Are you trying to take advantage of us? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? And It's like, wait a minute, I got in here to try and fix this. Do you know what I'm working on? And you got to be able to hold that position and just hold it. And some people say, oh, get thick skin. And I'm like, nah, man, I don't really want to be callous. You know, I like to be compassionate. I like to care about what's going on in my community, but it causes me extreme angst. So it's an easy thing to say, but you and I know what it's like to sit up and trying to do what you feel is good work and believing in your integrity of doing it. And at the same time, having people lob grenades at you and staying up at night being pissed about it. And then to have to refocus that energy and not eat yourself alive with it, but refocus it outwards into what you're doing. But let's realize that that is what these survivors, these thrivers of these disasters do every day. They've been beat down in the most surprised way imaginable. They pick themselves up, and then they have to figure out, where am I gonna build my life? No matter what resources are there available, private, public, nonprofit, there is a huge gap and a huge amount of grief. And the ultimate thing about resilience is that some of them come out of it and they're like, God, I'm back. Other ones look at me and are like, you know, I had one, Barry, who said, you know, I'm better off. It's almost scary for me to say that. He said, like I would never wish that my house burnt down, but I have more friends, more purpose, and than I've ever had in my life. And so I don't regret what happened.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, and I have like 50 million thoughts, but somebody recently said to me, your job looks so sad. And I was like, really? Because I feel honored to do it. And I didn't start the fire because it's not my fault that it happened. But the honor and the opportunity to actually step into that space to help people at this moment when they need an assist, like that's pretty awesome. But what can get in the way is that fear that some people in the public sector have of making themselves vulnerable to criticism. And I had this moment where in the, you know, when I wrote to Wade Crowfoot, who's a personal friend of mine. And I was like, you know, it's so frustrating to dedicate your life to making the world a little, just your tiny corner of the world, just a tiny bit better. And people come out of the woodwork to criticize you, but they don't, when they go to a baseball game and they see somebody who's making $11 million a year and they're drinking their $15 beer and their $20 hot dog, like no one's freaking out about that. So maybe I want to be less Jesus, Mary, and Joseph and more of a baseball player. And at 3 a.m. he wrote back to me and he was like, Jen, I hear you. And if you want to change trajectory, you can, and I will help you. But the work that you do matters. And just to hear that from a public sector, from somebody that I respected so much and who's remained so normal as a public sector face, really gave me sort of that, okay, all right, get up and do it again. And I see you very much in that vein of Wade Crowfoot as that servant leader who is not going to spin out, but in fact, you've actually had to get up and rise up again and again and again because we have had continual mega fires here. Can you talk about what that's like?
You know, there's, I think at last count, it was since 2017, I think it's 7 declared disasters, right? And then there's a litany of other ones. There's power shutoffs, there's homeless encampments, there's other things. It's the antithesis of what it was for my first year or so, which was, you know, let's call it complacent. Yeah, how late can you do your event at your winery, right? And everything like that. So for me, there's a part of it that is absolute purpose, as you say, and it's on the other side, it's very strange to learn how to not just be embodied by the disaster, but how to be calm in the middle of that storm. And that's what I've tried to learn how to do, is because I burn out in every one of these. My wife looks at me and she's like, I'm going to give you a week. And I lose my voice and I do other things and I work 110-hour days and I go do things. And I've learned to really get back to, in the peace times, is build the systems that mean I don't have to go that crazy and fill that many gaps or feel like I need to, and to live the ethos of make the we much bigger, right? Make the partnership that deploys. And so these later disasters that I've seen, I think our community is a perfect example of going from being on our heels in 2017 to really being at the point of the spear in terms of alert and warning, forecasting, ready for anything, and good to go there. But then, as you talk about, the other thing to transition into is how do you also be at peace? How do you not always be either responding to something or ready to go? I'm ready, And how do you get that place where you're like, okay, I can come home. I'm not going to do events. I'm going to pray, meditate, chill, reflect, whatever I need to do. I'm going to spend time with my kids. I'm going to go down to the Russian River so I don't hate my community, because I'm so dealing with like the angst of it and the complaint line and all of the disasters that I got to soak up the good too. So I think all of us in this work, in this purpose-driven work, where you at first think, because it's so purposeful, that you'll never burn out, and then you learn that you do, is that it's all about feeding your soul, and it's about finding peace in the process. And so that is a work in progress for me.
And even admitting that it's a work in progress is progress. Like I felt guilty for sleeping the first 2 years, and I'm now like, that was just dumb. So now when we're talking to new communities, we talk a lot about, self-care. Like it's a cliche, but it's true. Like you have to aggressively guard your mental health. And these have been challenging times. To have a mismanaged disaster that turned into a catastrophe on the global scale, and then to have to navigate these mega fires, which are now like puzzle pieces here. And so I'm glad that you brought it up, because we both know people who have not done that, wonderful people who lived in service to the community and then essentially broke.
Yeah, we have more retirements at the county than I've ever seen, and other things. A lot of people who were kind of in the twilight of their careers who were like, wow, I've done this for 3 iterations. I can't anymore. The pandemic's been really a backbreaker though too. Because it's, I feel like each of these disasters, the energy of the disaster itself mimics how the community responds to it. There's this kind of mimicry. So if you look at it, like there's a fire and there's all this intensity and burning and heat, and it feels like that in how we rebuild. It feels like that in the momentum that we created around that, right? The floods, slow moving, insidious, kind of drowning everything out, leaving it really dirty. It takes a long time to clean up. It's really mucky work. And it feels like that, kind of like you're washing off. The pandemic feels like a disease in this community. It's a crisis of confidence. It's like having a disease, even if you haven't contracted COVID, and it's like, oh, things keep changing. Today it's better, then tomorrow I got bad news, right? The goalposts change. I have to shut my business. I have to do this. And people, while they're in the midst of a disaster, you can't rally them in the midst of a disaster, right? They have to be able to process that disaster. So like for me and during the pandemic, if I go out and I'm like 3 months in, hey, let's identify and share news about how businesses are adapting.
What you're really talking about is how difficult it is sometimes to meet the community exactly where they're at and to deploy the same skills, because not all disasters are created equally, and the response to them is not identical, which we run into when we're meeting with people who are experts in wind and rain, and they're brand new to wildfire. And they're like, why can't we get a foothold in this community? And we said, because they're not even clean yet. So there is nothing to gut. There is no mold remediation, nothing is there anymore. So it sounds like you're saying that about the pandemic as well, that it does feel like an insidious disease. So talk about your strategies around being a public sector leader in the midst of this particular disaster.
In any vocation that you want to connect with people and be a part of the movement that's going on and be able to try and steer towards progress, right? Whether you're a follower, leader, compatriot, compadre, whatever you want to call it, you have to get a sense of what's the energy around you. You can't go into a room of grief and say, hey, time to rally, right? You can't go into a room where people are ready to rally and give them, and say, well, I, as the government, am going to bring you into a bureaucratic morass that will take you 6 months, and I'm going to work you out, I'm going to wear you out. So I think the big key is that, is feeling the different energies of those disasters. Like we've said, is fires are all about intensity. Floods are like this kind of, percolating, kind of washing over everything that we've dealt with, and a lot of cleanup. It's really dirty, right? It takes a long time, and some people who weren't flooded forget, and everybody else is just mucking around for a while. The pandemic feels like a disease. It feels like a crisis of confidence. It feels like somebody is infected and they get good news one day, bad news another day, and they're trying to just stabilize themselves. They kind of get to a place where they don't get too high or too low. And so you got to mimic that energy. You got to bring whatever it is to it. And good example for me was, I'm all about resilience. And there's a couple times where I would be like posting on social media, like, hey, I'm with this person, they're rebuilding and they're doing great. And I do that. And I'd have these folks who sometimes would write, not all of us can be strong all the time. To be able to be resilient, we got to be quiet every once in a while. I'd be like, thank you for that. And not only would I say thank you for that, then I'd send them like a direct message and I'd have a follow-up call with them. And then one of those calls ended up being a woman who lost her mom, whose mom died in the fires. And she was so full of pain, and all these people were moving on, and there'd never been acknowledgement of those left behind who didn't want to say, yeah, firefighters, you saved all of us, and things. Were like, no. So I sit down and spend months with her and a couple others on I'm still working on it, to figure out a memorial for the 24 who died. Like just tuning in and understanding that when they come at you, there's so much pain. They're not really coming at you, they're emoting, and you got to let that roar go out, and then you got to figure out how to work with it.
I think one of the things that I also like about you, because I have a little bit of a list, is that you are willing to say, I don't know. And that's a tough thing for a lot of people in the public sector to say, is I don't know, and I'm willing to learn, and I'm willing to listen. And that's a very scary place for a lot of elected officials in particular. So can you talk about that approach a little bit, how that served you?
Well, and the final one of that is what I can pledge to you is my effort, and I'm going to work my tail off for you. And it's going to be imperfect. And you're going to be pissed at times, and I'm going to have to figure out how to adapt. If you tell people like that, they forgive you so much. It's amazing how much buy-in there is achieved by letting people know that you don't know, but you're going to follow up, and you do follow up. That's the key. I mean, you have to do that.
Oh,
right?
Very important. Make sure don't skip past that. Do not promise anything that you do not deliver, because that's like a rule of our organization. Like if we say we're going to do it, we're going to do it. And as a public official, it's that we often hear these promises from the other side, the constituent level. And what we really want is a respectful partnership in creating change. And I like that you're not afraid to be in that space. But I do want to turn us to a little something called equity. And one of the things that from an outsider's perspective that I think has served you well is that you are fully bilingual. And one of the challenges has been, how to serve the Latinx community and meet them where they're at, and how to improve and how to admit where we missed a step. Can you talk about how being bilingual has helped as a community leader, but also some of the adjustments that you've had to make internally to better serve this critical part of our community, which is the Latinx community?
So I'll start with the conclusion, which is that this process has really taught me how to transition from being a partner to a champion to an ally, and ultimately into an accomplice, as somebody said, right? So our first big disaster hit, and about 2 days in, I'm running around chasing fires, doing videos, showing people, interviewing firefighters so that I can get people information. And I just go, realize that I speak Spanish and I need to step it up. So I just do this first video in Spanish, lo siento por no hacer videos en español hasta ahora. Voy a obligarme para hacerlo cada día horario para ustedes. All of a sudden it was shared 500 times, and all these people just saying, thank you for acknowledgement. That's it. acknowledging that. So that started this process. And I never thought that my Spanish, like growing up in the vineyard business, speaking pretty darn good, been living in Bolivia for 2 years in the Peace Corps, speaking Spanish all the time, that I would use it in a situation for like community organizing and not just to be like having fun and doing stuff. So all of a sudden it was like part of this imperfect, relentless progress that I talk about, right? Which is I had to like go in, I started to say, okay, let's go. And no one else was doing it. And so all of our bilingual staff just like rose to the challenge. We started to create like press conferences in Spanish. We started to roll. And at the end of that, we felt very confident that we had turned the page on something that was going to be a secondary disaster. But then it happened again. And then it happened again. And by the time we got into the pandemic, before this last round of fires, when I organized this big Latinx work group with like 100 different organizations represented, and here's the white dude again, right, who speaks pretty good Spanish and is an ally, I'm looking at him saying, how do we roll? What do we do? And they're like, you know what, Gore? Not what do we do? What the heck are you going to do? What the hell are you going to do? Right? Like, we're bootstrapping again. Where's the institutional side of it? So I took a different approach, which is like, okay, how do I not have this be about me speaking Spanish and trying to help organize people and bootstrapping and innovating? And so I brought a proposal to the board during the middle of a budget crisis, and we created an Office of Equity, and they couldn't not vote for it. Let's just say that, right? That's good policy making. You pin somebody into a corner.
It's true. They couldn't. But, and also though, I think that the county was very blessed by, and I think this is good for any county, if you have a particularly talented person in your community who understands the county, and it happens to be, the daughter of, farm worker advocates and is Alegría de la Cruz, then we got really lucky there, I think.
We have amazing capacity in our community. And I would say, I'm sure you with other communities you work with, they have that. And it's all about finding that and lifting that up. And that's the accomplice side of the equation is that it has to be about, letting that go, right? And institutionalizing it. And even that, if that's imperfect, it's somebody's damn job now. It's not duties as otherwise assigned on top of your normal duties to like lean on our bilingual staff to go out and like translate documents as they're trying to execute and run programs at the same time, right? Like, so core competency has been the whole thing of the reformation of our systems, and why I feel that we're truly much more resilient than we've ever been is because it's the Department of Emergency Management internally, huge staff, huge budget, but also a mandate to get things done, get money out the door, organize. Our Office of Recovery and Resiliency, like creating the list of like items that we're going to go, not just space cadet into a strategic plan, but like 200 actions, 140 have been completed. Some of it funded by some of the money, the subvention money that we got back from our utility and others from basically what we've been doing. More to put into that. Endless work, right? And the other side, this Office of Equity. And then leveraging into the final one for me, which is really partnerships, faith-based community partners, so that it's not just like every one of my 24 department heads has to manage partnerships, but it's like somebody's stinking job to help facilitate that. And those are the things that I'm really into now, even though they don't flash in the headlines. It's like the institutional change so that we don't have to just rally.
And reinvent it again, even though we've gotten quite good in this area at many things. One of those, that was one that continued to be a headache, and there's room for growth, but we are so much further ahead than we were even at the beginning of the pandemic or fires. So I'm very happy to see that. And I also appreciate one of the things that we give advice to new communities, especially if they're dealing with, historically marginalized groups, is to make sure that you are not deciding for them what they need and who they need to be, but instead you are, you could organize them. And then I like the fact that they looked at you and they said, well, what are you going to do for us? Because that's what they needed at that time. And it's empowering, and they have agency in their recovery, and they are partners, and they also have to show up. And that is the deal, because then they get to be the architects of their own recovery as well, instead of, they don't want to be the recipients of recovery. They want to be the architects of recovery as well. So I am very happy to see that change at the county, and I really appreciate it. a lot.
Uh, it's not surprising that it takes more time, more effort, and more imagination to be able to do the right thing than the easy thing, right? And we all know that equity is a big foundational part of that. And I had an interesting read the other day where somebody talked about it's like this idea of all these well-intentioned people and saying, you're not just a good person because you're well-intentioned. What the heck did it result in? What was the objective and did you achieve it? There was an article, an op-ed written about San Francisco, how it has more per capita Black Lives Matter signs than anywhere you could possibly find, but how many affordable housing projects and really true programs have gone into those areas? How many people are willing to sacrifice their own worth and their own view and their own other things to be able to make room for others, right? And that's really something that's in the mirror when we look in the mirror of Sonoma County. That's not San Francisco, right? We live with a legacy of, I want to support all the good things in the community, and I support all these efforts. I support homeless service outreach. I support affordable housing. I support all this stuff. I support disaster management, but not if it inconveniences me. And that is what we have to get over as people.
Yes, I like to say that people who show up to those meetings often, walked there on foot, went home to sleep in a meadow and paid with flower petals. Because what they don't seem to understand is their role in the system, and that we each have an opportunity to make it better, and we each have an opportunity to make it less inclusive, which is why in our area, like probably the most liberal place in the county, which I will not name on here, is also the most Caucasian. So there's a direct relationship sometimes to progressive values around, especially around land use and housing, and then that ostracizes or really extricates the diversity from the community. So we could talk about that, all day. So what I would like to do is, I would like you to give us what's your, top 5 or top 3, or even your top whatever for advice to someone who is currently in the public sector and either worried about disaster or has just undergone a disaster and they're like, okay, I'm listening to this podcast, but what do I do first? Just to summarize a lot of our conversation here, what's your top advice for that person?
I have this, I'll give you a top 3 and I'll link it to another kind of, mantra that I, picked up or came up with or whatever during this stuff. And it's wake up others and stay woke, right? And so, so the first thing is that, the world's upon us, right? Like these disasters are everywhere. Before the pandemic, a third of the counties in the entire United States has experienced at least one federally declared, which means big dog, natural disaster in the last 3 years, and all kinds of ancillary other ones. So this time of disruption is all around us. It's omnipresent. And it's like, don't act like we're going to go back to the land of milk and honey if that really ever existed and we weren't just stepping on other people and enjoying our privilege beforehand, right? Like the world's in a tough place right now and we have to own our future in it. So the second part of that, wake up others, is to me is understand that the we has to be expanded, that you have to get beyond the system that defines you, because it really holds you in. It's a jail cell unless you create partnerships and do the right work in the right way. An example of that would be in 2017, the activation of our what's called an emergency operations center. What I saw during that deployment was it was a bunker. And 2 years later in 2019, after a ton of reform and imperfect progress, it was a nexus. It was a place where information came in and out of, not just a bunch of practitioners going like, hey, I'm super well trained in managing disasters and planning for the apocalypse, and nobody knows who I am, but I'm going to throw out and tell everybody what to do, even though they don't follow my direction or have any confidence in me, right? And so the third one, which is this idea of stay woke, is that the biggest reason that we will falter is if we go back to complacency. So that's where you institutionalize this work. That's where you put it in, and you have to understand that you have to share your flaws with your community. You have to share your learning with your community. You can't just as a public official say, I don't know, I'm going to get back to you and I'm going to work hard. You also have to look out to them and say, we're not going to be able to save you all from yourself, right? You have to prepare. We can provide this, you can do that, right? But we're going to embed this into our systems so that we test our alert and warning system every year, even though it shows flaws, You have to show flaws, because otherwise the flaw will come out and it'll smack you in the face and give you a big black eye when it's time, when it's game time, right? When the bell rings and people are like, God, it looked like it worked out a lot, but he doesn't really know how to box, right? So, it's all to say is that, just get into the mix and start figuring it out and asking questions and demanding answers and reflecting what you, and by doing so, you'll be a better leader because you'll also be a better follower. You'll have your finger on the pulse, and you'll be able to get stuff done.
I love that. And so the next part I want you to talk to us about is often when we're dealing with new communities, there's a no surprise, a distrust, but also of public officials. There's a disconnect between the community and the public official. And part of that seems to be by a mutual decree. And other parts of it are, your average person who's been affected by a disaster doesn't always understand that, most of the stuff that doesn't get done is because nobody picked up the phone and asked how they could do it or how they could partner with the public sector. They didn't say, take a walk with me on my land. I'm going to show you my concern. They don't feel a sense of agency or empowerment. So what is your top advice to your person who has the energy and or the desire or has been wounded by this event? And how should they be interacting with their local elected leadership in order to make a change and get help?
One thing I realized when I was a younger man in my 20s is that I was like, God, why do I not have more people who I think are mentors? And it was because I never asked anybody to be my mentor. What did I think? Was I just assuming that the world was going to, God or some other thing was going to just put people in my lap, right? So the world is run by those who show up, is the point, right? And if people start showing up, they realize that they have way more power, way more agency, and way more opportunity than they ever realized. And I've watched countless individuals who have risen out of these stinking ashes and are just flying. And you know what? If you talk to them, they don't feel like they're the strongest, most powerful entities in the world. They feel wounded, but a part of true strength is being able to understand vulnerability and understand how that works and bring that to the table and be authentic about it. And not try to put it into a frame of perfect vernacular or a public comment or whatever. It's just speak your truth, right? We got way too much stuff going on for people to be silent these days. And there's way too many avenues to raise your voice than to be one of those tired souls who come, you see every once in a while who's like, I wanted to get in touch with you, but I didn't know how. I'm like, try Google, right? I mean, I do outreach, I do other stuff. I try to reach out to people. I try to activate people. I try to be infectious with my enthusiasm and my passion. But ultimately, leadership is, somebody told me a long time ago, leadership is this. And he stood up and he just took a step. It's like, that's leadership. Stand up and take a step. You'll be surprised.
And often, some people think, oh, I don't have, I didn't go to college, or, I'm doing this or that. So who am I to step into this space where they have imposter syndrome? And then I like to always tell them about Charles Brooks. And I'm like, that guy lost his house in the Paradise Fire, and he was a very competent, reusable grocery bag salesman. And his house burned down. And he was like, I don't know what I wanted. I know I want to help, but I don't know what that's going to look like. And then we went into a meeting with the mayor of Paradise and the town manager on day 12 of their fires. And he was a friend of a friend. I invited him along, and I just volunteered him to open his own chapter of a Rebuild Foundation. And he did it. And he actually is better at this than I am. He lapped me the second year. And I helped him the first year and the second year, and now he's like my best disaster friend on the planet. And I would say that to illustrate the strength of emergent leadership from your community that can be nurtured and supported. And I just think that that's incredibly important, and that people like you are very open and very receptive to people who want to make positive change, and you're not checking their CV to make sure that they are qualified.
Yeah, gosh, well put. It's yeah, the optimism I have for the future, in spite of these disasters, is based on what I see by the champions. Right? Is I could say, as somebody who didn't lose his home but was evacuated 8 or 9 times, but did not lose his home, I can say I've been a leader through a disaster. But really, I mean, I look at these folks and like, they give me energy, right, each and every day. And I think that's, as we translate disasters to this, that's the tough thing about the pandemic, is people are so isolated in that world. There's such a difficult way of creating community and rallying through Zoom or other things. So it's an important time for us to take a reflective, step back and understand how we do this better too. Because in 2017, once again, versus 2019, Kincaid fire, very similar events. I call it a tale of two fires, right? We were ready. We were always a few steps ahead of it, and we got still smacked by something, but it stopped before it became like a natural cataclysmic disaster, right? And it's the same thing with this pandemic, is that we've been, put in our place. And it's like all the systems that, I guess, all the planning, I mean, so-called people have been planning for pandemics for decades. Doesn't seem like anybody knows what the heck's going on, and they've all been trying to iterate and figure it out on the fly. And so this is just another thing that we have to just go, eat our humble pie and go back to work. And that's the work. It's
and learn our way through it. Because you don't plan for when you're ready for a pandemic, and you don't plan for when you're ready for a natural disaster, but you can build some of your internal systems and strengths and share your knowledge once you have it too. Pay it forward. And I just want to thank you for all the times that you've showed up to help pay it forward to other communities, and that you've been a strong friend to Rebuild North Bay and myself. And thank you so much for being on today, James.
I'm inspired by what y'all do. And, you can't, you talk about empowerment, you talk about, helping people gain agency about what they're trying to do. You can't do that authentically if you're afraid of what they're going to do with that, right? You just got to realize that this world needs a lot more people who stand up and take action. And that's going to be how we own our place in the future. And that's how we're going to sustain each other, because it's not just about us getting better and better as individuals. It's about resilient communities. So thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on How to Disaster, a playbook to recover, rebuild, and reimagine. I want to leave you with this one thought. Thank you for spending your time with us. And we want you to know that you can get through this. You can recover, rebuild, and reimagine. But there's only one way you're going to do it, and that's together.